watch my face. I want someone to go back.
Nathan, are we live?
Yes, we are. It looks like we've got a fair number who've joined. I'll keep admitting people as they come in.
Well, folks, let's go ahead and get underway. The June meeting of the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission will come to order. I hope you've all, and the note says the recording is in process. That's good. I hope all of you have found a cool spot from which to zoom in for our meeting today. JLARC agendas are known to be jam-packed. We have a little bit of summertime relief for today, but nonetheless very important matters to take up. I'd ask if we could call on our director, Hal Greer, for direction for the meeting today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members, Madam Vice Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Nathan Skreslet to call the roll and to review meeting logistics. Nathan?
Good morning, members of the Commission. Thanks for joining us today. I'll keep this brief because I think everyone's pretty familiar with how this works by now. As usual, we have our three tiers of our participants today. Members of the Commission and JLARC staff are full panelists. That is, they can use full video and audio capabilities. We also have a fair number of attendees today who we will not be seeing or hearing from them unless the Commission has questions directly for them, in which case we can promote them to panelist status. We do that to keep the number of simultaneous streams down. For everybody else, members of the media and the public will be streaming this live to a JLARC YouTube feed. And would like to remind everyone to please mute your mics when not in use. It's okay if you happen to forget, I can do that remotely. However, I cannot activate mics remotely, so you'll have to do that from your end. Our presenters, when they're doing the presentations, will pause regularly to invite questions. Please ask the chair to be recognized to ask your question or make your comment. And if you're calling in, I believe we do have one caller today. Just please identify yourself so we know who you are. And if you have any technical problems during the meeting, we'll do our best to resolve those. You can contact our office and we'll try and get that taken care of for you. So let's see, let's do our roll call for today. Do we have Delegate Austin?
Present.
Delegate Carr?
Present.
Speaker Philicorn?
Present.
Delegate Cox?
Here.
Ms. Henshaw?
Here.
Oh, thank you. Leader Herring?
Present.
Senator Howell? I haven't seen Senator Howell yet. Senator Locke?
Present.
Senator Norman?
Je suis ici.
Senator McPike?
Present.
Delegate Orrock? Maybe not. Delegate Plum?
Here.
Delegate Sickles.
Here.
Thank you. Senator Spruill.
Norman, that means yo. Yeah.
And Delegate Torian.
Here. Present.
All right, thank you all. Let me turn it back over to Hal.
Thank you, Nathan. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned at the last commission meeting, we have hired 4 new analysts in 2021. 2 of them joined the staff in February, and then 2 joined us just recently in May. This morning, I'd like to introduce the 2 members of our staff. The first is Mitchell Berry. Mitchell earned his BA in Psychology and English from the University of Richmond, his master's in Education from UVA, and will complete his PhD in Education Leadership, Policy, and Justice from Virginia Commonwealth University later this year. Mitch has held a variety of research positions and conducted a variety of research projects. Most recently, he has served as a research assistant with the Metropolitan Education Research Consortium. Mitch has been assigned to the guardianship study. Also joining us in May was Sam Lesseman. Sam earned a BA in History and Psychology from the University of Virginia and recently completed his master's in Public Policy from UVA's Batten School. In 2019, Sam served as a governor's fellow in the Transportation Secretariat. Sam has been assigned to the housing study. Mr. Chairman, we have 2 main items on today's agenda. First, we'll present the findings from our most recent in-depth review of economic development incentives. Then we'll present our comparative analysis of the marijuana legalization legislation in the 2020 JLARC report on marijuana legalization. I'd like to now turn it over to Associate Director Kimberly Sarte, who oversees our economic development work, to introduce the first presentation. Kimberly?
Thank you, Hal, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. As you may recall, as Hal said, JLARC has ongoing responsibility to evaluate the state's economic development incentives on an ongoing basis. And as part of this effort, each year we conduct an in-depth evaluation of a subset of incentives. So next, Ellen Miller, who is our Chief Economic Development Analyst, will be presenting our findings on the evaluation of Virginia's trade and transportation industry incentives. To conduct our evaluations, as you may recall, we do contract with UVA's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. So I'd also like to acknowledge Terry Repan, who is a regional economist with Weldon Cooper and who actually does a lot of the work on these incentives. And I believe Terry is also on the call today to help answer any questions that you may have. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the various state agencies that were involved with this review. And that would include the Virginia Port Authority, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, and the Department of Taxation. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ellen.
Hey, Kimberly. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, there we go. So good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'm Ellen Miller, and I'll present our findings on the evaluations of Virginia's trade and transportation industry incentive. Slide 2 describes our mandate, which directs us to evaluate the state's economic development incentives. This report on trade and transportation incentives is our 5th in-depth evaluation. The types of incentives covered in our 4 prior reports are listed here on this slide. This report covers 11 incentives to promote international trade and growth in several transportation industry sectors. The incentives include 3 sales tax exemptions for common carrier transportation providers, sales tax exemptions to encourage the aircraft repair and rolling stock manufacturing industries in the state, 4 incentives to encourage use of Virginia's ports, and 2 programs designed to increase international exports. Slide 5 lists our major findings for this report, starting with the common carrier exemptions. For these, we found they meet certain objectives, but the primary benefit of the airline common carrier exemption could be met with another existing exemption. We found that the railroad rolling stock exemption has not led to an expansion of railroad rolling stock manufacturing in the state, and that the aircraft repair parts exemption, while too new to fully evaluate, is unlikely to significantly increase aircraft repair activity in the state. We found that the port-related incentives, 3 of which are tax credits, have mixed ability to meet their objectives, but they're estimated to have higher economic benefits than many incentives, particularly other tax incentives. And last, the valet and trade show assistance programs are estimated to have high economic benefits and returns in state revenue. I'll first turn to our findings and recommendations for the common carrier exemptions. So the state offers 3 exemptions for common carriers, and they're just entities that make their services available to the general public, as opposed to a private carrier, which basically transports its own goods, or a contract carrier that transports goods for only a few clients. Virginia offers 3 common carrier exemptions, one for railroads, one for airlines, and one for ships and vessels. These exemptions reduce the cost of purchasing equipment, repair parts, and supplies that are necessary for these companies to provide their respective transportation services as a way to promote the development and growth of these industries in the state. As you can see, the railroad common carrier exemption is by far the largest of the 3 exemptions. The airline and ships and vessels exemptions are also among Virginia's oldest incentives and were adopted at the same time as the retail sales and use tax in 1966. Many states, including Virginia, adopted the incentives, these types of incentives for common carriers for several reasons, including to reduce costs of heavily regulated transportation services. The railroad exemption was adopted later in 1978 after other state-level tax changes to how railroads are taxed in Virginia. By their existence, the common carrier exemptions meet certain objectives for which they were adopted, such as helping to support the provision of safe transportation for passengers and cargo, and to support the importance of these companies in interstate and foreign commerce. The exemptions also improve the tax system by providing similar tax treatment to rail, air, and maritime transportation providers. And they ensure that intermediate goods that are purchased by these businesses to provide their transportation services are not taxed. The railroad exemption also supports a mode of transportation that can reduce road congestion and air pollution. Stakeholders reported that all 3 exemptions are important to their respective industries. For example, the railroad exemption helps support the viability of the smaller short-line railroads, which have low profit margins. The airline exemption helps maintain and expand airline maintenance facilities, which are often located at airline hubs, and is where airlines can make major repairs to their planes. The ships and vessels exemption was reported to be particularly important if Hampton Road starts losing out on Navy shipbuilding contracts. There is some indication that the Navy may incorporate smaller ships that can be built elsewhere into their fleet. So maintaining the exemption could help with transition to more commercial work. In terms of their economic development objectives, we found that other factors have much greater influence on rail, airline, and shipping activity in the state than the common carrier exemptions. Research indicates that the presence of rail-dependent industries is a key factor influencing rail activity in the state. And Virginia has a lower presence of rail-dependent industries than other states. Industry employment is a standard measure of industry activity. And we found that Virginia has a lower concentration of rail employment than the national average. We also found that Virginia's rail employment has declined faster than the nation's, and this is likely because Virginia's coal industry, which is heavily rail dependent, has also declined faster than the nation's. We also found that areas with higher concentrations of airline and aircraft maintenance employment tend to be near major airline hubs. So think of Delta's hub in Atlanta, Georgia, and American Airlines has a big hub in its biggest hub in Austin, Texas. They also have located near large aircraft manufacturing facilities. And as many of you may know, Washington State has several large Boeing facilities. Virginia, however, is not a major hub for any major airline and has a much smaller presence of aircraft manufacturers. And then last, Virginia's exemption for ships and vessels has little impact on Virginia's commercial shipbuilding and repair activity. So Virginia does have the largest shipbuilding and repair industry in the US, and this is because of Newport News Shipbuilding. However, nearly all of the work at Newport News Shipbuilding, as well as the smaller shipyards in Virginia, are for the Navy, which doesn't benefit from this particular exemption. Only 5% of Virginia's shipbuilding and repair activity is commercial. We also estimated that Virginia's commercial ship repair activity has declined some over the last 20 years, whereas it has slightly increased for the nation. In terms of the economic impact of the common carrier exemptions, we estimate that they have low to negligible economic benefits for every $1 million spent on the exemptions and low to negligible returns in state revenue. Just as a reminder, we use 3 measures to estimate economic benefits, and they are job creation, state GDP, and personal income. We also assess benefits per 1 million in spending to make the results comparable across incentives, because spending does vary quite a bit by incentive. We also assess the return in state revenue for every $1 spent on the incentive. And then we compare the results across all incentives that we have evaluated so far and rate each incentive as having high, moderate, low, or negligible economic benefits and returns in state revenue. This slide shows that the railroad common carrier exemption has low economic benefits and spend per 1 million in spending and a low return in revenue per $1 spent, while the economic benefits and returns in revenue for the other 2 exemptions are negligible. The railroad common carrier exemption is higher than the other 2, mainly because purchases of lumber for railroad ties and also the labor for track repair and maintenance are largely Virginia-based. Basically, that just means that the multiplier for this exemption is higher. The last point I'll make about this slide is that these low to negligible results are typical for tax incentives. Because the railroad and ships and vessels exemptions do meet some of their objectives, it seems reasonable to maintain them, even though they have little impact on rail and shipping activity in the state. Nearly all other states have similar exemptions, and eliminating them would likely make Virginia seem less competitive or business friendly. Eliminating the exemption for railroads, but maintaining the others, would also likely result in legal challenges because of a federal law that prohibits states from adopting taxes that discriminate against railroads in favor of other transportation modes. Consideration could be given, though, to eliminating the airline common carrier exemption. The primary distinction between this exemption and the other 2 is that airline maintenance would still be exempt under the aircraft repair parts exemption, which I'll cover in my next section. If this airline common carrier exemption were eliminated, Virginia would still be consistent with 20 states that just have an aircraft parts exemption. Though eliminating the exemption would mean that items like baggage and ground equipment that are used by airlines would no longer be exempt. Slide 21 lists the policy option for the General Assembly to consider eliminating the airline common carrier exemption. We have it as a policy option rather than a recommendation because we feel it's a policy judgment best made by the General Assembly. There basically are some trade-offs. So on the one hand, it could be eliminated because airline maintenance would be covered by another exemption, and Virginia would be more consistent with other states that exempt just airline maintenance and repair. However, as I mentioned earlier, some items would no longer be exempt, and eliminating the exemption would be a change in longstanding tax policy. This policy option is also tied to another option we have later for the General Assembly to consider regarding the aircraft repair parts exemption. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here for a moment if there are any questions about the common carrier exemptions.
Members of the commission have questions. If you do, raise your hand or call out. Again, a reminder, these presentations on the incentives, we're on a rolling cycle of looking at all the tax incentives, and it happens that these have popped up in this time cycle to be considered. But over the course of a half a dozen years, we will consider all the tax exemptions in turn. Does anyone have any questions specifically now on this part of the presentation? Hearing none, then Ellen, let's go forward.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, I will turn to our findings and recommendations for the aircraft repair parts exemption. This exemption was adopted in 2017 and it became effective July 1st, 2018. So fiscal year 19 is when it became effective. The purpose of this exemption is to promote the aircraft repair industry in the state. It exempts purchases of parts and supplies used to repair and maintain aircraft. Technically, the airlines that I just talked about in the airline common carrier exemption are also eligible for this exemption, but they already use another exemption. So we really consider the beneficiaries right now for this exemption to be charter airlines and also privately owned airplanes or corporations that own their own airplanes. In terms of the largest group of potential beneficiaries, though, we estimate that it's really owners of recreational and sport planes, which makes this exemption different than many other Virginia sales tax exemptions. Most exemptions are either for businesses or if they are for individuals, they are for necessities. Turning to our findings, we found that the aircraft repair parts exemption likely will have limited effect on the aircraft maintenance and repair industry in the state. We don't have sufficient years of data yet to do a trend analysis on the change in this industry because the industry is so new. Stakeholders have indicated that there has been an increase in repair activity. However, we haven't been able to verify that yet. Still, we think the exemption will only have a limited impact because it indirectly benefits aircraft repair facilities, which are commonly known as MROs, which are maintenance, repair, and overhaul facilities. MROs do not claim or use the exemption themselves, but they can offer tax-exempt repair work, which may encourage plane owners to use their facility. So basically, this exemption helps to support their client base. Virginia also has a very small portion of MRO repair and maintenance employment. It's less than 1% of national employment in this sector, and it is unlikely that the exemption alone will change this. We also found that the exemption has negligible economic benefits per 1 million spent and a negligible return in state revenue. For every 1 million spent on the exemption, we estimate that 4 jobs, 0.4 in personal income were added to the Virginia economy on average. However, there was a loss in state GDP. The return in revenue is also negligible. Only 2 cents in revenue is generated for every $1 spent on the exemption. Even though benefits are negligible and the exemption will likely have a limited impact on repair activity in the state, consideration could be given to extending and improving the exemption. One reason to extend it is to allow for a more thorough evaluation at a future time of the impact of the exemption on aircraft repair activity in the state. By maintaining the exemption, Virginia would be consistent with the majority of states that just have an aircraft repair parts exemption. But if it is extended, we recommend changes to improve the economic benefits of the exemption, specifically to restrict it to repairs of planes for business uses. And these are the planes that we anticipate are more likely to go out of state for repair. Slide 29 lists our policy option that the General Assembly consider extending the exemption, and if it does, our recommendation to better target it to repair of aircraft used for business purposes. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again for any questions.
Questions? Yes, sir. Identify yourself, please. Did I hear a question? I guess not. Okay, Ellen, I guess we can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'll turn to the railroad rolling stock exemption. This exemption was established in 2007 to support railroad rolling stock manufacturing in the state. Basically, rolling stock is locomotives and rail cars. So railroad common carriers can purchase rolling stock tax-free through the railroad common carrier exemption. This exemption extends the ability to purchase rolling stock tax-free to other rail-using industries. We found that the railroad rolling stock industry has not expanded since the exemption was established in 2007. And you can see this on slide 33. Now, there was an expansion in terms of employment between 2010 and 2015. However, after that time, employment declined, and now it is below its 2007 level. So when we were talking to stakeholders, they indicated that really the exemption was adopted to support Freight Car America, which located in Roanoke in 2005. However, and many of you probably know, the facility shut down in 2019. And actually, Virginia no longer has a railroad rolling stock manufacturer. This doesn't mean, however, that the exemption will no longer have a cost to the state. And the reason is that companies can still use the exemption if they purchase rolling stock from an out-of-state company, but it's delivered to them in Virginia, because at that point, the point of sale is in Virginia, and either the tax or the exemption would be applied at that point. In terms of economic impact, we estimated that the rolling stock exemption has negligible economic benefits and negligible returns in state revenue relative to other incentives. This slide shows our estimates of the economic benefit and the return in revenue. Because the industry has not expanded, Freight Car America has shut down, and the economic benefits are negligible, we recommend that the General Assembly consider eliminating the railroad rolling stock exemption. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again.
Questions on railroad rolling stock exemption?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Delegate Sickles.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Just like to ask Ellen, just for clarification. So there's two railroads on the East Coast that are longer haul railroads, and neither one of them are based in Virginia, and one of them has just left Virginia, and but the railroad that left Virginia, when they buy new equipment, new rolling stock, they have to pay whatever sales tax exemption, sales tax is applicable in the state they're in. They cannot use this anymore, even though they have a presence here. Is that right?
So they would be using, if I understand your question correctly, it sounds like if it's a railroad, they would be using the railroad rolling stock exemption. If they purchase it in Virginia, I would presume they could use the exemption, but I might be incorrect. But they might not use the exemption if they purchase it in another state that doesn't have it. That sounds right. Does that help your question, Delegate?
So if they buy rolling stock from one of their offices in Virginia where they still have employees here, then they would qualify. If they bought in Virginia, they would qualify for this exemption, even though the cars will be used all over many different states. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Sickles, that sounds right. I may be wrong, but the sales tax is based on where the sale takes place. So if the sale takes place in Virginia, then it should be sales tax exempt. And I believe, if I'm incorrect,
Okay.
hopefully, I think someone from tax is on the line if that is incorrect.
So, I mean, we don't have any manufacturers, but you said that they get the sales tax exemption from buying it in Nebraska or whatever. They get the sales tax exemption here, even though they're not even headquartered here. If some entity I don't understand how that works.
So
We can move on, Mr. Chairman.
yeah, and I'd be glad to follow up with the tax department and you related to this line of questioning.
Well, if someone is on from tax, if you could just make contact with Kimberly or someone in the meantime, maybe we can come back to that in a few minutes. My thought is the general rule is the point of sale is where the exempt, where the tax is applied or the exemption would be applied. But let's see if someone can fill in a detail for us in the meantime. If not, we'll come back to you by email, Delegate Sickles, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
All right. Other questions? Ellen, go ahead.
Okay. So next I'll turn to Virginia's 4 port-related incentives. So Virginia has 4 port incentives to promote the use of Virginia's port facilities, including a grant for companies that locate or expand in the state and use the Port of Virginia, a port volume increase tax credit that companies can earn if they increase their port cargo over the prior year, an international trade facility tax credit that companies can earn if they create new jobs or make capital investment in Virginia and increase their cargo volume through the port, and a barge and rail usage tax credit that companies can earn if they use port facilities and also divert cargo from truck to either barge or rail. In terms of spending over the last 7 years, the port volume increase tax credit is by far the largest of the incentives, followed by the Port of Virginia grant. While eligible beneficiaries vary to some extent by program, so far the vast majority of awards are to manufacturers. One thing I'll point out here is that both import and export cargo can also qualify for the credits. We don't have statistics for each incentives, but we do know that more than half of the port volume increase tax credits have been to import cargo. We found that the port incentives have mixed success in promoting use of the port because many other factors influence port selection. And my next slide has several examples. One of the factors is geographical advantages, of which Virginia's ports have several. For example, Virginia is relatively distant from its closest competitor ports. The ports in Hampton Roads also have the advantage of being in a naturally deep harbor, and it is currently being expanded as well. The Virginia Port Authority, which operates the port, and the state have also made a number of improvements to either the port itself and the highway, bridge, and rail infrastructure to help speed up the flow of cargo in and out of the port. We found that many incentive users are in the Port of Virginia's captive market, which includes Hampton Roads in Eastern Virginia, which goes up to the northern neck. And it also includes Central Virginia, which is in the other category of this graph. We also found that utilization of the credits has been relatively low. All 3 credits have annual caps, and altogether they equal $4.95 million per year. So to date, about $44.5 million of credits could have been awarded. However, only about half of that amount has been awarded, though as you can see, it varies quite a bit by credit. And not all of these amounts have been claimed on tax returns yet. We did find, though, that the Port of Virginia grant has achieved its job creation goals, and the barge and rail usage tax credit has other benefits. So the Port of Virginia grant is awarded after job creation occurs, but then jobs have to be maintained 3 years after receiving the grant. So essentially their goal is to maintain the jobs. And this slide shows that during our time period, all projects collectively maintain the appropriate job levels, and some have created additional jobs after receiving the grant. The rationale for the barge and rail usage tax credit is that there are benefits to diverting cargo off roads to barge or rail to reduce accidents, road congestion, maintenance, and air pollution. In an effort to quantify the benefits, we used a cost-benefit model that was developed to estimate the benefits of projects that receive grants from another state program, the Rail Enhancement Fund. Using this methodology, we estimate that the benefits of the credit are more than twice the cost of the credit. Despite some of these challenges, the port incentives are estimated to have low to moderate economic benefits per 1 million in spending, and all 4 port incentives have moderate returns in revenue when compared to other incentives. So I split the incentives up into 2 slides just to make it more visible. And I'll start with the Port of Virginia grant and the Port Volume Increase Tax Credit, which both have moderate economic benefits and moderate returns in state revenue. One thing I want to note is very few tax incentives so far have had moderate benefits and moderate returns in state revenue. The International Trade Facility Tax Credit and the Barge and Rail Usage Tax Credit have low economic benefits and moderate returns in state revenue. Even though their economic benefits are low, they are estimated to have higher benefits than most other tax incentives and even some of Virginia's grants. And I have a slide later that will show you that grants tend to have high to moderate economic benefits. The reason that these incentives are higher than other tax incentives is because the users of the credits are mostly manufacturers, and the credits also have minimum requirements that companies must meet in order to earn them. Slide 52 summarizes our recommendations for the General Assembly to consider. One is to better target the incentives to export cargo, which has a greater benefit to the state economy than import cargo, which often displaces goods that are in the local economy. The other is to convert the Port Volume Increase Tax Credit to a grant. This would allow the Port Authority to use more discretion and better target awards to industries and locations that are less likely to otherwise use the ports. Grants are also generally more usable than tax credits. Then we have 2 recommendations for the Port Authority to work with other stakeholders to develop proposals for the General Assembly to consider adopting. One proposal focuses on better aligning the Port of Virginia grant guidelines with the guidelines that are used by the VEDP. For example, the Port of Virginia grant does not have as a requirement that awards be made to competitive projects, which are basically projects that are considered in other states. The other proposal would provide detailed recommendations for how best to combine the International Trade Facility Tax Credit and the Port of Virginia grant into one robust grant program, but still maintain some of the features of both programs. Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here again for any questions.
Questions on the port programs?
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
Charnel.
yes,
Yes,
Herring.
thank you. And if it's going too deep in the woods, or just tell me, because we can do it, discuss it offline. I found it compelling. I think you said there was about $700,000 in benefits to $250,000 in costs. And you mentioned there was modeling that was done. I'm just interested what was used to calculate that. Like, how was that measured? And if that's too deep into it, like.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Delegate Herring, we can certainly follow up on more detail, but just broadly, so the Department of Rail and Public Transportation has a program, and they worked with a national transportation consultant to develop the model. So it is, an existing model that Virginia uses. It seems to be a pretty standard model for this type of thing. And basically, because of that purpose of the barge and rail tax credit, we were just trying, to quantify, some of that benefit. But in terms of, the detail about it, I can certainly follow up with you and any of the other members that are interested.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to jump in. We've also elevated tax, and Kristen Collins from the Department of Taxation and Terry Reppan from UVA. And so going back to Delegate Sickles' question on the rail incentives, they may be able to kind of expand on what Ellen said and maybe clarify and confirm if either of them would like to speak up.
Okay, so let's take a moment and go back to Delegate Sickles' question, if we could. Delegate Sickles, you're still on the line?
Yeah, I don't know if I can articulate it again. So if you're a national railroad, it's not based in Virginia, but the sales tax exemption is applied at the point of sale. You would think they might want to buy all their rolling stock from a Virginia location to get the exemption, or does every state have the same exemption? I'm just wondering how this works when these companies aren't based here in Virginia and their rolling stock doesn't just work in Virginia, it works all over the East Coast in these two cases.
This is Terry Repan from the Weldon Cooper Center, Delegate Sickles. Let me address your question. I think Ellen incorrectly referred to the two railroads as using the railroad rolling stock exemption. I think she meant the common carrier exemption.
Yeah.
And virtually every state has that, particularly for rolling stock. I think every state has a rolling stock exemption. Some of them don't have exemptions for the railroad track, conduit, anything associated with the rail facilities themselves. And of course, Virginia does have that. So it's not really going to be an issue in regards to Norfolk Southern and CSX. They can get that exemption anywhere.
Okay.
Okay. Delegate Sickles, does that satisfy your query?
Yeah. So we would not want to get rid of it, or it wouldn't matter if we got rid of it. We would just lose a salesman would not be able to locate in Virginia and sell their product here. So that's why we wouldn't want to get rid of it, I think.
Okay.
Because it, they're not gonna pay sales tax anywhere. They would never buy it in a state that didn't have this exemption. So, we'd be hurting ourselves to get rid of it.
Yeah, and then
Can Mr. Rapan respond to that?
Well, it's going to take you back to before the exemption was adopted at the time, apparently to incentivize Freight Car America to locate. So that extended the exemption to other manufacturers, chemical companies, coal mining companies, et cetera, could then take advantage of that exemption. And of course, they use it and they're happy to have it. We did discuss with several manufacturers, including the Virginia Manufacturing Association. They like it. And, an argument can be made that in a way you're incentivizing companies to use the rail network instead of highways. However, the type of companies that appear to be using it are ones that would be using rail anyway, that's they got very heavy freight that they're transporting. So it doesn't seem to be necessarily incentivizing that in the way that some of the Department of Rail public transport grant programs, the Rail Preservation Fund, for instance, they're trying to incentivize individual companies to use the rail network by helping fund short rail spur development and things of that nature. So it's not as well targeted as maybe it could be if the goal was to incentivize companies to begin to use rail. But the General Assembly, there's a lot of different things that you need to consider here, and I mean you pointed out one.
So I'm going to suggest that the staff follow up with an email further clarifying that issue. And of course, ultimately, it will be a matter of the General Assembly and a policy discussion to decide what we're going to do about it. But hopefully that we can, with an email, factually describe how it currently works.
Mr. Chairman, we can certainly do that. We will definitely follow up to all the commission members with email.
Thank you so much. Now, see, Ellen, we are now on the Valley and Trade Show incentives.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So VALET is a 2-year accelerator program designed to help small to mid-sized companies increase their international exports. The program provides in-depth training and technical assistance, as well as up to $30,000 for export-related expenses. The Trade Show Assistance Program is a relatively new program that was established by VEDP in 2016. This program provides up to $10,000 to help cover the cost of trade show participation. Both programs mostly benefit manufacturers or companies in the professional, scientific, and technical services industries. Both programs are also relatively low cost, though the number of participants per year is about 50 for VALET and over 200 for the Trade Show Assistance Program. Participants of both programs report positive effects. One thing to note is that VEDP annually surveys participants of these programs and has conducted 2 in-depth surveys of the VALET program. And this is quite different than what other agencies do for many of the incentives that they evaluate, or that they administer, I'm sorry. This slide highlights some of the findings from VEDP surveys. They found that 81% of VALET participants report increased international sales after completion of the program. 92% of Trade Show Assistance Program participants report the program helped achieve their international goals. I also want to note that VALET is recognized as a nationally as a model program, and that's because it carefully selects participants expected to have high export potential, and the program is highly structured. Most notably, we estimated that both programs have high economic benefits and returns in state revenue. This slide gives you an idea of what that looks like. Each of the programs is estimated to have created nearly 300 jobs, over 50 million in state GDP, and about 30 million in personal income on average for every 1 million spent on the programs. Each program is also estimated to generate returns and revenue that are well over $1 for every dollar spent. So essentially, the programs more than pay for themselves. In wrapping up this part of my presentation, I just wanted to point out that 70% of the grants and all of the loan programs that we've evaluated so far have had high and moderate economic benefits. On the other hand, about 77% of the tax incentives we've evaluated have had low or negligible economic benefits. The reason that grants and loans tend to do better is that grants tend to be better targeted, and loans represent no cost to the state unless there is a default on the loan. Grants also tend to be discretionary and have requirements for minimum levels of new activity that companies have to meet to be eligible for the incentives. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation of our evaluation of these 11 incentives. And I'd be glad to answer any other questions that members may have.
Any further questions from commission members? Then do we have a motion to receive the report? I need a
So
motion.
moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, it's been moved by Senator McPike and seconded by Delegate Carr to receive the report. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are there
Aye.
Aye.
persons in opposition? Hearing none, then it passes unanimously. We received the report, and thanks to the staff for that in-depth report. And we will look forward to the next cycle. Does that then conclude our next cycle? Conclude the tax incentives?
Chairman Plum, no, we have. So our next batch of incentives, which I'll briefly bring them up right now. So we'll report that out probably next June, sometime during one of our summer meetings. And then we'll probably have about 2 more rounds of incentive or groups of incentives to evaluate. So probably about 2 more reports after this one next June or sometime next summer.
Okay, well, we want some more that's like the VALET program that has a nice payoff. So dig up some of those and tell us about them too.
We'll look. But just real quickly, our next round will include 11 incentives that cover sort of like science and technology related industries. So there are several R&D related incentives. There are several high-tech startup related incentives that provide awards for like capital, venture capital, and also the CIT grant gap program. That's also in the list, and several space related exemptions. So that's what we plan to cover next.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll move on now to comparing the marijuana legislation to JLARC report. Members may recall that in passing the legislation, one of the enactment requirements was that JLARC make this report. Director Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since you've set that up nicely, I'll just turn it now over to Justin Brown, our Senior Associate Director, who oversaw the marijuana study. Justin?
Thank you, Hal. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I just briefly wanted to say before Mark makes his presentation, to just mention that it's a somewhat different product from what we normally give you. As Chairman Plum said, the bill that the General Assembly passed this spring to legalize marijuana had an enactment clause directing us to compare the bill to our November 2020 report. So Mark has a 15 to 20 minute presentation to fulfill that requirement. He's got a lot of detail on the document, but this morning is only going to focus on the key items that we think require some attention or consideration by either you or some state agencies. And just to set this up, we've selected the items to kind of bring to your attention based on a really detailed kind of review by our team of the final bill. It changed quite a bit as it went through the legislative process. And then comparing that to certainly the recommendations and options in our report, but also our report text, as well as some of what we just learned and observed and came to our attention throughout the legislative process. So with that as background, I'll now turn it over to Mark Gridman, who was the project leader for our review of marijuana legalization.
Mark, we look forward to your report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully my screen is appearing on yours.
So far, so good.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. As you said, I'll be following up on our 2020 legalization report. Normally I would slip in a bad joke here, but I'm trying to turn over a new leaf this morning. As you'll recall, legislation enacted this past session legalizes adult possession of marijuana and, if reenacted, authorizes its eventual commercial sale. The legislation also directed JLARC to analyze the new law, compare it to what was proposed in our report, and present our analysis to the General Assembly. To start that off, I'd like to give you an overview of what the Legalization Act accomplished. On the whole, Virginia's Legalization Act is largely consistent with the recommendations and options that we presented in our report. You can see here that 80% of what we recommended to include was in fact adopted. Additionally, 80% of the options we proposed for achieving specific policy goals, such as promoting social equity, were also adopted. This slide gives you a sense for the wide range of provisions that were enacted. In a nutshell, the Act legalizes marijuana use by adults 21 and over, effective July 1st, directs the expungement of records for marijuana possession offenses, creates a regulated commercial market where marijuana can be legally produced and sold at retail to of-age adults. But again, that provision will need to be reenacted to take effect. The Act also provides funding and creates programs for promoting social equity and protecting public health. And it establishes a new marijuana retail sales tax with a significant portion of tax revenues going to fund those equity and health programs. While the Legalization Act did address much of what JLARC recommended, staff identified some areas where refinements or clarifications could be considered. Here I'll walk through those areas where we think further action should be strongly considered. First in that category is possession limits. The law adopts a minimum legal age of 21 and sets a 1 ounce public possession limit, both of which are what we recommended. However, the public possession limits and penalties are not as graduated as we suggested. In contrast to other states, the penalties in Virginia escalate from a $25 civil penalty for possessing more than an ounce to a Class 6 felony for possessing more than a pound, 16 ounces. All other states have a misdemeanor charge for possession, and those typically kick in at much lower possession amounts, ranging from 1 to 2.5 ounces. One thing I want to reemphasize here is that we're only talking about the limits for how much marijuana someone can possess on their person or in a public place. These limits do not apply to the amounts that can be possessed at home. With that in mind, we suggest you consider establishing a misdemeanor public possession limit that is lower than the current 1 pound felony limit. This line at the top is the current law, and you can see how much someone can have in a public place before there is a criminal charge. Keep in mind that an ounce is typically enough to last all but the heaviest users several weeks, so 16 ounces is a substantial amount for someone to be carrying around. The line at the bottom is an example of what the possession amount limits would look like if you added in a misdemeanor charge like other states. Essentially, you would keep the civil penalty in place for small amounts above the legal limit, and then have a misdemeanor charge that would start at an amount that's somewhere between the civil penalty and the felony offense. If you want to be on the least punitive end of the legalized states, the misdemeanor amount could be set at around 2.5 to 5 ounces. Our second note on possession has to do with the equivalencies for marijuana products. These equivalencies determine what amounts of edibles, vape oils, and other products are equal to 1 legal ounce of plant material. The law directs the newly created regulator, DCCA, to define these equivalencies in regulation. Those regs would then determine how much of these products a person can legally possess. The wrinkle here is that DCCA will be established on the same day that adult possession is legalized, so it won't be possible for it to have regs in place beforehand. So from July 1st, up until those regs are established, there won't be clear equivalent possession limits on these products. What we suggest here is for VCCA to immediately implement emergency regulations to establish those equivalency limits. The emergency regs process can move pretty quickly, so VCCA should be able to do this within a few weeks. Next are the rules regarding commercial adult use market participation by medical marijuana license holders. The law allows the state's 5 medical marijuana licensees to participate in all aspects of the new market. This is similar to what we proposed in our report, with the one difference being the law gives them a bigger retail footprint. Each medical licensee is allowed to sell adult use marijuana at all of its 6 currently allowed dispensaries. That's a total of 30 locations statewide, which is equal to about 7% of all the retail stores that will eventually be allowed. Given that these businesses would have a competitive advantage from being vertically integrated, we propose limiting them to half that number, or 3 retail stores per licensee. This, of course, only applies to their adult use sales. They could still sell medical marijuana at all of their dispensary locations. This slide looks at the rules allowing participation in the market by registered industrial hemp processors. While hemp isn't something that we got into in our report, we saw that there might be some unintended consequences here that could undermine what the new law is trying to achieve. Namely, it appears that the law may allow any business to go and register as a hemp processor, pay a $1 million vertical integration fee, and then set up shop as a vertically integrated marijuana business that falls outside of the state's license caps. To put that more simply, we think this might create a loophole around the caps and the vertical integration restrictions. That's because, unlike the medical marijuana licenses, just about anyone can become registered as a hemp processor, and there's no limit on their numbers. As a result, it's possible that any number of big businesses could come in and use this loophole to establish multiple cultivation facilities and retail stores. To avoid that outcome, the state should eliminate those provisions that provide special treatment to hemp processors. Another issue we identified is how the caps on the 2 classes of cultivation licenses might work. The law creates a Class A and a Class B cultivation license. Class A can grow marijuana, and Class B can grow low THC hemp. Most of the marijuana for the commercial market is going to come from those Class A cultivators. The Class B licenses are mainly just there to help hemp growers. The issue here is that both Class A and B will count towards the 450 license cap for cultivation. Those Class B licenses can therefore take away some undetermined number of licenses from the Class A cultivators. If enough licenses go to those Class B folks, there could be a serious undersupply problem in the market. The solution we suggest you consider is separating the license caps for the two classes of licenses. The new law creates a timeline for establishing the commercial marijuana market, which we lay out in this first bullet. We compared those dates to ours, and we noticed the law may not leave enough time at the end for businesses to get their operations up and running. Currently, the law creates a 6-month window between when VCCA can accept its first set of applications and when retail sales can begin. That doesn't appear to be enough time for businesses and VCCA to do all the things they'll need to do before sales start. For example, businesses will need to submit applications, get approved for licenses, set up their operation, have them inspected by the regulator, and if they're a cultivator, they'll need a couple more months to grow their first marijuana crop. It'll be hard for most businesses to get all that done by January of 2024. To give businesses more time, the dates for implementing regulations and accepting applications could be moved up by 6 months. That would give businesses in VCCA a 1-year window from when applications can be accepted to the start of retail sales. The trade-off is this would shorten VCCA's regulation setting period. However, that shorter period would still give VCCA more time than has been given to regulators in other legalized states. I should note that there is no requirement for anyone to actually start selling marijuana in January of 2024. That's just when the law allows it to happen. However, there's likely to be a lot of public expectation for the market to open at that time. If most of the shelves are empty come January, it could be harder for the legal market to compete against an already entrenched illegal market. This slide is really targeted at VCCA. As I mentioned earlier, the commercial aspects of legalization must be reenacted. This creates some uncertainty in the commercial laws that the regulations are going to be based on. However, if the market is going to open by January of 2024, VCCA should probably start drafting initial regulations this fall. One of the things we looked at is if VCCA has all of the powers it will need to regulate the market. The law appears to do a good job of giving it broad but clear regulatory authority. The one area we thought could use clarification is making sure that VCCA has the authority to create different classes of licenses within each license type. For example, VCCA should have the authority to create different classes of cultivation licenses, this time based on the size of the cultivation operation. This approach is used in states like Colorado and Washington. JLARC recommended granting the regulator with this authority for a number of reasons. It would allow VCCA to better ensure the market is not going to be over or undersupplied. It would also help VCCA prevent a few large cultivators from taking over the market. It could make life easier on applicants and license holders as well, because regulatory requirements could be scaled to different kinds of operations. For example, an edibles bakery could have a different set of requirements than a manufacturing facility that's producing vape oil cartridges. Testing is another area where a lot of what we recommend was enacted, but there were a few differences. The main difference is that the law gives VCCA all responsibility for overseeing marijuana testing labs, whereas we recommended giving some of these duties to the state's Division of Consolidated Laboratory Services. And to give you an example, the law tasks VCCA with establishing equipment certification and calibration practices for the testing facilities. This seems to require the kind of specialized scientific and regulatory expertise that DCLS already has. So it might make sense to shift some of those duties over there. This would replicate the approach that the state has used in a few other regulatory areas. For example, the health department is the main regulator for drinking water quality, but private labs are the ones that actually test water samples, and DCLS certifies those labs to do those tests. Splitting up statutory duties appropriately could be tricky. So we suggest over the next few months that VCCA and DCLS work together to determine if and how that should be done. The proposal could then be presented to the appropriate legislative committees and used to develop any needed legislation. I would add that DCLS would need additional resources if it is to take on duties in this area. The next topic is the Community Reinvestment Fund and Grant Program. As you'll recall, 30% of the state's net marijuana tax revenues will be deposited in a newly created Cannabis Equity Reinvestment Fund. A board is established to administer that fund, and the board will make grant awards to projects intended to improve communities. That structure is largely consistent with an option that we've developed. The key difference is that we recommended that the board be directed to take a number of additional steps to ensure transparency. Those steps are listed here on the slide and are consistent with our advice for other similar grant programs. We also looked at the criteria that the new law sets for social equity eligibility. As a refresher, if someone is eligible for social equity status, they qualify for assistance programs, low interest loans, and get preference in the initial round of license awards. This is an area where a number of states, other states have faced a number of challenges, so we cannot recommend specific criteria. However, we did note that broader criteria may not be as effective as more narrow criteria. Broad criteria are appealing because they extend eligibility to more individuals, and you're less likely to leave out someone who is deserving. The trade-off is that those criteria also bring in a lot of people who are not in economic need and have not been harmed by marijuana laws. With that in mind, we found that narrow criteria might better accomplish social equity goals. They appear to better direct eligibility at persons who are most likely to be deserving, and they reduce the possibility that people who have not been harmed by marijuana laws will receive benefits intended for others. This slide shows you the current criteria for social equity eligibility. The key point here is that a person only needs to meet one of these criteria. While we can't yet firmly estimate how many people might be eligible under these criteria, we believe it will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 to 1 million, depending on how the geographic areas in bullets 4 and 5 are drawn. Perhaps the broadest criterion is the one that extends eligibility to family members of persons convicted of marijuana offenses. This probably extends eligibility to around 300,000 people, but it could be more. The more eligible people you have, the more will qualify for social equity status, license assistance, and preferential treatment. So in some ways that could be a good thing because, at least in theory, deserving people aren't being left out. The key question to consider is how many family members are likely to have actually been harmed. If it's only a small portion, then the criterion will pull in a lot of people who haven't been harmed, increasing competition and allowing them to take away opportunities for those who have been harmed. This is something that appears to have happened in Illinois' social equity program, which also used this as a criterion. Illinois' effort has been roundly criticized as ineffective by advocates in that state. To put some data on this, remember that about 90% of marijuana convictions are for simple possession offenses, which typically result in fines or probation. Only about 10% of marijuana convictions result in jail or prison time, and even then a typical sentence is a few days or less. So while there are certainly some cases where a person's conviction had a negative impact on family members, such as children or spouses, there are likely to be many other cases where the impact was minimal or non-existent. The last wrinkle here is that it could be challenging for VCCA to verify familial status. The risk is that the additional level of verification that would be required would slow down eligibility decisions and license awards. To reduce the chances of unintended parties benefiting from social equity status, the state could eliminate the criterion extending eligibility to family members of convicted persons. This last slide is really for the new regulatory agency. Basically, we want to make sure that they have a clear definition of business ownership for social equity applicants. Other states have had problems with loose statutory definitions they have been taken advantage of. Letting VCCA define ownership in regs, let them put together a really tight definition and quickly close any loopholes if they see the program being misused. Mr. Chair, this next group of topics includes potential changes we believe merit some further consideration. We think these changes could improve the law or better achieve certain policy goals, but the case for action is not as strong as in that first group. We have a number of topics in this category. And most of these are changes that would most closely align the new law with what we have in our report. For example, the law allows small businesses to be vertically integrated. However, the way it does this is a little different from what we proposed, and we think there might be a more effective way to accomplish that goal. Some of this is just clarification that we thought might be helpful. For example, the law doesn't set a home possession limit. Some states have those, but not all, but they could help clear up a potential gray area in the law. Mr. Chair, I was not planning on going through all of these, but I'm happy to field any questions about them at your discretion.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. I would say that those who added to the legislation the enactment provision that we take a look at where we are at this point in time certainly did us a favor.
Mr. Chair, I believe your mic has been muted.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I think you're muted again, Mr. Chairman.
Senator McPike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions as a follow-up. First, thank you, Hal and Mark, for the review. It's very helpful. And as the chairman indicated, I'm glad we included the provision in the enactment clause. The first is on the discussion of the medical providers and partial vertical integration and the recommendations in relation to the number of stores. Was it also part of the review or consideration the requirement that those that of our medical providers also require a diversity of product? In other words, not requiring them to have 100% of their own product on the shelves, but also require them to have other Virginia suppliers as part of that mix.
We didn't have anything to report or any analysis specific to that, but in the course of our research, we found that is a requirement that some other states have done to try to keep vertically integrated businesses from dominating the market. I would say that, Senator, in most of those cases, it has been states where vertical integration is the norm, but that is certainly something that could be tried.
Okay, thank you. One more follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Senator McPike.
Thank you, sir. In relation to the vertical integration for the industrial hemp side, I remember the subcommittee having some level of discussions around this as well, and whether it'd be better defined with sort of a food or commercial grade. That way it's not just a industrial hemp with small and a garage, but it's actually has a size and scale that meets sort of the other requirements of investments. Because I think there's a little bit different way to probably define some of the terms involved to better, I think more narrowly and more clearly define what the eligibility versus what you had indicated, Mr. Goodman, which is sort of it's wide open right now. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Senator McPike, yes, the way that it is defined right now, I believe the statute, and again, I would preface this all by saying I am not an attorney. This is our interpretation. We have talked with the folks at VDEX to confirm that we're interpreting their definitions properly. It appears that the definitions used in the law for registered hemp processor would refer to this group of businesses or even individuals that have a very minimal qualification. I can't remember the exact number, but there are several hundred of them, I believe, registered industrial hemp processors at the moment. As this slide here shows, to become registered, it's a pretty easy process. Senator, you or I could become registered as hemp processors if we were so inclined. So right now, the way it stands, that because they are eliminated or not covered by the caps, they can, any business that became registered could pay that, and that could afford to pay the $1 million fee that's set for vertical integration, could do that and become operating in the state, and it would not count towards license caps. So if there was a goal to keep some of these businesses or direct benefit or not benefits, but to allow some hemp businesses to fall into this category, our recommendation there would be to tighten that up a lot. I'm not sure exactly how you would go about doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And members, I would remind you that we are filling our statutory duty by making this comparison of where we are and where we might be based on the JLARC earlier recommendations. It's not a matter for our action today, but I have an idea that there are a whole lot of people who paid a whole lot of attention to the recommendations of this report, and I know we'll be hearing from those in subsequent legislative sessions. So with that, we will move on.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Senator Norman.
Thank you very much. An editorial comment. I commented during the session that I thought this was one of the worst drafted pieces of legislation of my legislative career. And the reason is, and I think we ought to take away an institutional lesson, regardless of partisan persuasions or a bicameral legislature. To me, it highlighted the challenges with creating an omnibus bill. And we have done that on a number of occasions, but I don't think we have ever done it with such disparate subjects rolled into it. And I'm a little bit of a realist. First of all, I was one of the early legislative pioneers on this topic and had always said we needed to move forward deliberately. I recognize that atmospheric conditions change, and there are those who want what they want and they want it now. I recall on the Senate when it came up that there was a comment that was a refrain that I had heard in another venue. And because it was such an incredibly comprehensive and long piece of legislation, I question how many legislators actually ever read the whole bill. But we were told, vote on it and then read it. And I suggest to you, Mr. Chairman, that because of the complexity of this issue, it is all over the board. The governor put in what some have argued, right to work provisions. There's a provision that jumping from 1 ounce to a civil penalty to a felony. Clearly that needs to be, I think, readdressed, and blessedly, we have the opportunity through some reenactment provisions to do that. That whole social equity eligibility is a complete farce. It has such broad parameters that are undefined, and it's amusing to me. I would venture to say that professionally, I have dealt with more marijuana issues than probably everyone on this call put together. But you look at that, and it's almost amusing to me that we're taking something that was on the books for many years that was a criminal offense, whether it was misdemeanor or felony, and now saying that if you had a family member that could have been affected when only 10% people were ever incarcerated, that you're going to be eligible for some kind of restitution. Or if you went to a historic Black college, that immediately makes you eligible for some form of a restitution. without regard to any bias whatsoever, I really think we need to look at that very carefully. Staff has already indicated that there's a universe of 300,000 out there, and we haven't even gotten into the multiplier effect on this. So I'm hoping, one, that we as a legislature working collaboratively will be very circumspect on moving forward on omnibus bills like this, because it does not allow legislators the flexibility to individually address policy issues such as rolled in this. And secondly, I hope that that in the future sessions, we will address some of these frailties which are so conspicuous. I apologize for the editorial comments, but I just feel compelled to say that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and Charnel Herring, we'll recognize you for editorial comment, and then we'll be closing out.
Right. Right, and thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was a decision for the omnibus to be omnibus. It was the governor's bill. Senator's been in the body and the General Assembly longer than me. I've seen some bad pieces of legislation. I don't agree. It's probably, his opinion is the worst piece. I disagree. I've seen worse. I can give many examples. But I think that this is a significant change. And when we're reaching for equity and when we're reaching for restorative justice, it's not perfect, but I think we're moving in a direction where we can hit perfection. I don't know what happened in the Senate, but in the House, our members read the bill. It's not that difficult to read the number of pages in that bill. With respect to impacts on family members, I think it's naive to say that just because someone in the family has a conviction, it doesn't impact others. I would say that immediate family members are impacted. And I'm sure the Senator is very aware, and many of you are aware, that when you have a conviction on your record, it's more difficult to get a job. It's difficult to get money to start a business. So there is an impact on family members. Now, if we want to, certainly I imagine, but given the recommendations we'll discuss, maybe massaging that section and minimizing the scope of it. Just because 300,000 people are eligible doesn't mean that 300,000 people are going to go for the social equity license. I think that we cannot be blind to the impact that this failed war on drugs has had, and especially for the Black community. We cannot toss this away, or I say criticize it in such a fashion when we ignore the economic impact, beneficial economic impact it will have for farmers in the Southwest region of our Commonwealth. And also the money that would be generated for children who don't have access to pre-K right now. So it's not perfect. I can think of a lot of pieces of legislation that have been worse than this, but I am willing to work with the senator, and we come back next year. Hopefully I come back and we continue to work. I think that this is actually, we are on a good course, and we continue to work and have debate that's civil, but also please don't turn a blind eye to the families that are impacted, especially children whose parents have had a conviction. And not because they're guilty. Some parents actually plead guilty because they need to get home. All of those factors need to be considered. And when we look at policy. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Herring. And I would say to both of our speakers, having served longer than either of you, I can predict with some certainty that this subject will be on the legislative agenda for future sessions as long as you are here. This is a topic that is a complex one. It's not going to go away. I do again commend those who had the forethought first to have a study done by JLARC in a nonpartisan kind of way, and secondly, to have us then take a look at what the legislation looks like in relation to what those recommendations were. So I think the meeting today has served a good purpose. It does not reach a fixed conclusion, but it provides the background for which we can have those discussions in the future. Hal, we are a bit over time, but I want to call on you to wind up our meeting and give us some look ahead as what's coming up with JLARC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just speak briefly. I did want to update the commission on our VEC work. Mr. Chairman, in light of the continued concerns expressed by members of this commission and others regarding the administration and operation of the Virginia Employment Commission's unemployment insurance program, we plan to move up the presentation of some of the findings from our review of VEC to the September meeting of JLARC. In September, we'll present key findings and recommendations regarding VEC's processing of unemployment insurance claims, its progress toward modernizing the IT system that it uses to receive and process these claims, and other key aspects of the agency's performance. We will still plan to issue the full and final report on VEC in November. The next meeting of our commission, Mr. Chairman, will be Tuesday, July the 5th. On the agenda for the July meeting will be VRS and the Virginia 529 program. We really appreciate your attention this morning. And that's all I have.
Any items before the commission? Hearing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Mike moves and second, Dr. Carr. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.